Good morning. It's good to be here with you. When I was about 5, my grandmother came to live in our house. It was one of those big wooden houses in the Northeast, and the upstairs was a self-contained apartment where my mother and dad and sister and I lived, and the downstairs was a self-contained apartment where my grandma would come to live. Grandma had a couple of bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen that, even by today's standards, was huge. Once my grandmother was living with us rather than across town, I began to learn a lot more about her. For example, she had no use for clock watching. My grandmother was on time to exactly nothing in her lifetime. And curiously, it seemed to not bother her at all. But this was very different than the culture upstairs, where time management and punctuality were expected. Downstairs, my grandmother might giggle about my mother's obsession with punctuality, but I noticed my grandmother had a very definite rhythm in her week. Mondays were laundry day. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday had their special activities, but Friday was baking day. My grandmother baked pies and cakes and cookies and all the usual dessert stuff, but on Fridays she always baked 4 loaves of bread. 2 loaves would go upstairs, 1 would stay downstairs, and 1 would go to someone in the community. All week long between her baking days, Grandma would think about who in our community might benefit from a loaf of bread. So on Fridays, by the time I'd get home from school and open Grandma's door, the aroma of baking bread saturated every cubic inch of her home. I'd help dry the dishes and put them away, and by then, the bread was usually cool enough to slice. And Grandma would cut the heel off the bread because that was my favorite part, and that would be my treat. And then I'd take the 4th loaf to whomever Grandma and God had chosen. Over the 6 or 7 years that we shared a house, I baked with my grandmother a lot. When I married and set up my own kitchen, she sent me her recipe for bread. I tried and tried to make that bread, but I could not get it to rise. One day at work, I was complaining and whining about another failed attempt. My coworker, Sue Mitchell, who many of you know from our parish, said, "Paula, I've got a computer program that might help. It'll take the ingredients from your grandmother's recipe in the 1940s and translate it to what's available in stores today." Well, it had never occurred to me that gold medal flour might be different in 1950 than it is today, but indeed it is. So Sue took that recipe, she translated it, and she brought it back to me, along with a loaf of bread that tasted exactly like my grandmother's. Well, back to the kitchen I went. Obviously, there was a flaw in the recipe, and now it would be all right. But for me, it is still an epic fail. I have never gotten that bread to rise. Well, a bunch of years went by, and one day I got a phone call from the Mitchells saying that they were going to host a church committee meeting in their home over lunch. And if I would come, they would provide lunch so that I could get back to the office quickly. When I got to their house, Sue opened the door, and I knew. Without a word being exchanged, I knew that Sue had made my grandmother's bread, because every cubic inch of Sue's home held the aroma of that bread. I had not experienced that aroma in 45 years, but the memory of all those Friday baking days is part of me. And Sue, I don't know if you know it or not, but I have retired, and I am often available for lunch. I have long since forgotten the sound of my grandma's voice, how many pounds she weighed, what her wardrobe looked like. But her way of being in this world, the way of loving and baking and giving, is imprinted in my memory through that aroma. Still, 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 one can hear the falling snow, for all is hushed, the world is sleeping, Holy star, its vigil keeping, still, still, still. One can hear the falling snow. Like the opening of John's Gospel that we heard a few minutes ago, this Christmas hymn offers us something other than a dusty camel ride to Bethlehem, a virgin birth, or even a manger scene. It is much more than a story about one historical event. The Johannine community that's writing to us is writing to us about Christ, the Word become flesh, who lives among us. Lawrence Stuckey wrote a book titled Calendar, Christ's Time for the Church. With just a couple of sentences, he captures the Johannine theology of Christmas. Here's what he says. Christmas commemorates the appearing of that eternal Word in our midst. Divinity takes on humanity to restore the image of God implanted at creation, but sullied by sin. Here is the great exchange that Christmas ponders, that God became like us, that we might become like God. In taking on flesh, Christ invites the experience of human life. As a baby, he will be dependent on others for food and nurture. As a young person, Jesus will know the pain of Joseph's death. And at a too young age, he will become the head of his household. His hands will become calloused as he labors to provide for his family. Subject to the same continuum of time we experience, Jesus will age, and like us, he will die. By this gift, we are invited into the life of the eternal Word, not as divine beings, but as participants in divine love. This gift is not for the faint of heart. It is a calling to transform our way of being, to dwell in a state of becoming, always moving toward God's image already within us. The time in which we live needs a lot of hope and love. We need to know that the television news we watch at night is not a highlight reel for human existence. We have within us the memory of the Word, the spiritual DNA of God's breath who calls forth creation. When others see our way of being, they come into the presence of that memory. Like the aroma of Grandma's bread, 45 years later, there is recognition of something planted deeply within us. And here, I think, is a pivotal point for us. What hung in the air at Sue's home that day was not my grandmother's bread. It was Sue's bread. It was her interpretation of my grandmother's recipe, Sue's generosity, and Sue's expression of love. This way of love is demonstrated in many of the ministries at St. Martin's, but one stood out to me as I was reflecting on this sermon. Each month, we prepare 120 lunches for homeless people in Fort Worth. Every lunch bag contains food, and our youth and adults decorate those bags with art and scripture verses. For the one who receives a bag, long after the food has been eaten and the bag thrown away, there is the memory of being touched by people, children. The recipient of that food does not ask if we who made it are Republicans or Democrats, white or black, speakers of English or Spanish, straight or gay, citizen or not. These are words that belong to human culture. But in the feeding of God's people, hungry people, Christ is present. It is literally Christmas. This weekend, I saw the movie about Fred Rogers called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And at one point in that film, Mr. Rogers and a journalist are riding along in a subway in New York City. I don't know if you've ever ridden in the subway in New York, but if you have, you know it can be a kind of edgy experience. Well, this car was filled with a wonderfully diverse slice of humanity. And the folks in it were kind of nervously looking around to see just how edgy the ride was going to be, when one young woman's eyes rested on Mr. Rogers, and she bravely began to sing, "It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood." And suddenly, all the people on the subway car began to sing with her until she got to the ending, and everyone was singing, "Won't you be my neighbor?" And it struck me that Mr. Rogers, he was not a superhero. He didn't have any kind of, garment that he jumped into other than a cardigan sweater. He wasn't a movie star. He wasn't a football player, not even a cowboy. He was a person who chose to live in a loving and kind way. His way of being was authentic, and children knew it. Madeleine L'Engle put it this way: "We do not draw people to Christ by loudly discrediting what they believe, by telling them how wrong they are and how right we are, but by showing them a light that is so lovely that they want with all their hearts to know the source of it." The Gospel of John opens with a theologically evocative message. The Holy Star is still keeping its vigil. It is shining over you and me, here and now, still, still, still.